afternoon, all, and welcome to the Supervision webinar. I'm Amber Martinez. I am the Youth Peer Support Training Specialist on the McSilver branch of the Peer Technical Assistance Center, or Peer Tech. And today I am joined with several of my colleagues from McSilver and other institutions, and we're just going to give this great presentation on supervision. We hope you all enjoy it. We also have a number of wonderful presenters today who will be sharing their expertise and knowledge related to our topic. And so we would like to thank them for their time. Okay, so we would appreciate everyone taking the time to join us today. And as you know, or if you've joined any of our other webinars, we would like to know who's in the room, who's joined us today. So we're going to ask you to take a few minutes and finish the poll that just popped up. Let us know in what capacity you have joined us and indicating your primary role. We'll give everyone a minute to respond to that. Cool. As you can see, we have a lot of clinical leaders and supervisors, which is very adequate for the webinar we have today. I just want to go over some housekeeping rules as we wait for respondents to come in and get settled in. I just want to mention that our presentation today will be recorded, and the slides and recording will be made available and posted to our page, which if you don't know, we could include in the chat. peertech.org, and you will be able to access the slides and recordings within 2 or 3 days. I also want to encourage you all in the chat to introduce yourselves if you would like, share any questions you may have for the presenters to be answered as time allows, as well as encourage all of you to join us for our consultation call next week at the same time, where participants and everybody that's presenting today will have an opportunity to present and then have participants ask questions. You can sign up for the consultation call also on our webpage. So just a quick overview of our mission. We have several partners with PeerTech. PeerTech has been established with funding through OMH to facilitate the inclusion of peer support services in the mental health setting. Our role in PeerTech will be to provide training and technical support assistance to help that inclusion and implementation process go more smoothly for clinics. Lastly, our partners, 2 organizations were chosen to support this effort. The Academy of Peer Services, which is managed by Rutgers University, and NYU's McSilver Institute in partnership with Families Together in New York State and Youth Power. PeerTech will be consulting with a number of peer-run and peer-savvy organizations to assist in the development of training, group consultation, resources, and tool sharing for agencies that have joined us today and through all our webinar series. Here is a list of our partners as well. And I will pass it over to Rita, who will introduce our presenters today.
Thanks so much, Amber, and thank you for giving us a great introduction. I'm Rita Cronice, and I'm the co-director along with Yvette Kelly of PeerTech. And I just wanted to give a quick introduction to today's presenters. Carrie Ann Rollier is the Director of Workforce Development and Training at Families Together. She's been a family peer advocate for 8 years, first working in community-based organization and currently with Families Together in New York State since 2022. Her passion for peer support and supporting its workforce is what led to her position as Director of Workforce Development and Training at Families Together, leading a team that oversees the credentialing process and training of family peer advocates and youth peer advocates across the state. Our next presenter is Robbie Lettieri. He's the Director of Youth Training with Families Together in New York State and Youth Power. Robert Lettieri is a national public speaker and advocate who is passionate about creating a more inclusive and supportive society. Growing up in both the healthcare and mental health system, Robert is dedicated to advocating for others who have endured both similar and abstract hardships. Being a part of multiple boards and committees on the state and local level, he consistently strives to advocate for the larger voice. With years of experience managing a statewide workforce and directing a statewide training program, Robert takes his passion for advocacy to new levels every opportunity he gets. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Edwards, who is a consultant and a researcher. Dr. Edwards is a public health advisor, workforce development consultant, licensed clinical social worker, certified peer specialist, and advocate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. Dr. Edwards' research focuses on job satisfaction, supervision, peer support worker implementation, and organizational change. He is a co-editor of the book, What It Takes, Wisdom of Peer Support Specialists and Supervisors. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joanne Forbes. She's a consultant, an author, board member at Baltic Street AEH. Dr. Forbes is a graduate of Rutgers University Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation. Her research addresses the experiences of peer support specialists supervised by non-peer supervisors. She has years of experience in the field of psychiatry as a therapist, educator, advocate, and administrator. She is a frequent presenter at conferences and is the author of the book Madness, Heroes Returning from the Front Lines. And she's also a co-editor on What It Takes, Wisdom of Peer Support Specialists and Supervisors. She is one of the original founders of Baltic Street AEH, one of the largest national peer-run agencies, and she's been widely recognized by state and national organizations as a visionary and an advocate for those diagnosed with mental illnesses. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Carrie Ann. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. So we're going to talk about best practices for supervising family peer advocates. It's very important to create a working alliance between the supervisor and the family peer advocate. The goal of a family peer advocate supervisor is to be a coach, mentor, a sounding board. Supervisors need to create a strong alliance with FPAs in order to offer effective supervision. Creating that strong alliance is going to do a few different things. It's going to increase the likelihood that the FPA will discuss on the job challenges. They're more likely to feel comfortable discussing pros and cons of the supervisor's suggestions or directives. And the family peer advocate would be more likely to feel comfortable discussing their own thoughts to improve the program or the service. Supervising should be supportive, and that's how the family peer advocate should feel, as well as the supervisor should be portraying that support. When we think of agendas for supervision meetings, they should be mostly set by the family peer advocate. Supervisors may have one or two agenda items that they need to be sure is discussed, but I tend to think of supervision meetings as the person that I'm supervising. It's their meeting, it's not mine. It's a place for them to be able to bring questions, ask for support, ask for guidance, and address those things. Very, very, very few times I have an agenda when I go into a supervision meeting with somebody that I'm supervising. Work wellness is super important for family peer advocates, and it really should be a top priority that is encouraged, supported, and modeled. If the family peer advocate is seeing their supervisor not practice work wellness, then they're going to be less likely to do so. So taking care of yourself so that you can take care of others, we all know how important that is. The supervision meeting really should feel like a safe place for family peer advocates to let them express feelings, feelings of anger, frustration, uncertainty, and be supported in that. nobody likes to talk about negative feelings. And I have a saying that no feelings are negative, they're just feelings. Everybody feels the negative feelings. And there's nothing wrong with that. What is important is what you do with your actions with those feelings. And that's where the support needs to be, and the space to allow for those feelings that are portrayed as negative is super important, because if they're not allowed to do that, then you're going to see burnout, and we don't want that to be happening. Starfish stories, and I did steal the term from my coworker Robbie. So starfish stories are successes, whether they're big or small. And so when we're thinking of supervision support, we don't want to only focus on the challenges that the staff member is facing. We also want to acknowledge and celebrate small and big successes throughout their work. Consistency is super important. Holding regular supervision meetings is going to build trust, and it also provides support for that family peer advocate to carry out their job effectively. And notice I said regularly held, not regularly scheduled. So if we are scheduling meetings on a regular basis, but oftentimes they're not being held, that's not helpful. So regularly regularly holding, even if they do need to be maybe moved around because of things that come up. So, things do come up, and that is okay. Support for a family peer advocate doesn't just stop with the supervisor or the agency. There are regional and state supports that are available to them all throughout New York. There are Families Together OMH regional advisors in every region. Know who they are, reach out to them, connect them to the family peer advocates. Families Together holds events throughout the year. So encourage your staff to attend those, allow them the time to help with the financial burden of these events if that is needed. And being able to travel like to Albany for the annual conference was something that I look forward to all throughout my 8 years of being a family peer advocate. And it was so rewarding to be able to do that. And I felt like I was in a place that I was very supported, and I learned a ton, and not just from the workshops that are offered, but just from conversations with other advocates and other family members and the attendees. Connection and support from the Families Together Workforce Development Department. We are the credentialing body for the Family Peer Advocate credential, as well as the Youth Peer Advocate credential, making sure that your family peer advocate is connected to us in our department. We're more than just saying yes or no to credentials, and we can answer questions, give them support, give them, if we can't answer a question directly, then we're going to point them to a person who can. Everybody is more than welcome to reach out to us at any time. There's look for regional and state advisory committees for family peer advocates. Great way for them to be involved in their credentialing process and policies and trainings and education. So there's a couple different types of supervision. So there's individual supervision, which everybody is pretty self-explanatory, one-on-one. That is absolutely needed and very necessary to be held on a regular basis. You could also do group supervision. And there's a few different types of group supervision. You could have a very large group supervision where maybe an entire program or department is involved in the group supervision. There may be a smaller group supervision where it's just family peer advocates, or maybe just peer staff if you have an agency who maybe only has 1 or 2 family peer advocates, has a couple youth peer, has a couple adult peer, having a group supervision with all of the peer staff in your agency, or even just the one service. And you can have, you can divide that up however way best fits your agency and your staff members. And I highly recommend asking the staff how they would like, which types of group supervisions they would like to have, because they may have an idea that you haven't thought of. Supervisor education. If a supervisor is not a family peer advocate themselves, I first very much encourage agencies to always strive to get to that point to be able to do. If you're new to having family peer advocates in your agency, this may not be able to happen right away, but it's something that you should always be striving to have family peer advocates supervising family peer advocates. In the case where that is not something that's able to do, the education of that supervisor is very essential. Families Together in partnership with CTAC has on the CTAC website some training right around this. There's 2 things. There's the Family Peer Advocate Hiring Toolkit, which we've gone over in another webinar. And there's also a Family Peer Advocate orientation and training for supervisors specifically. Highly recommend that you look at those and take those. And I will pass it along to Robbie.
Thanks, Carrie Ann. Hey, everybody. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about best practices for supervising youth peer advocates. So first and foremost, I would say that consistency is key. It's essential that YPAs know that they have a designated date and time when they are meeting with you as a supervisor to receive that individualized and authentic support. So OMH guidelines suggest that supervision is happening for YPAs at least once a week. Due to the nature of my work, I speak with a lot of YPAs from across the state, and there are some YPAs that are getting supervision at most on a monthly basis. That shouldn't be. And I get it, we all have a lot of things going on. However, it's really important that we are advocating to offer supervision at least once a week to YPAs. As Carrie Ann was speaking about, we can also offer group supervision. We can, if we have a few YPAs that are on our team, how can we foster that community? How can we foster those leadership skills to our entire staff? And also allow YPAs to receive that mutual support from other YPAs doing the work with them. And then, as we have spoken about in previous webinars during the series, the monthly regional youth peer meetings that are facilitated by the regional youth partners. That is a great way for YPAs to have a sense of community, to see that they aren't the only YPAs. A lot of agencies only have one YPA on their staff. And so these are a really great opportunity for YPAs to say, hey, I'm experiencing this and I'm not sure how to handle it. How did you handle this in your workplace? Or just to have a sense of companionship and be like, okay, this is really nice. I'm not alone in this work. So if you want to get in touch with your regional youth partners, feel free to put that in the chat box and I will send them directly to you. All right, next up. Supervision should be guided by the youth peer advocate. However, there are always going to be those lulls, or there might be days and times when YPAs are like, I don't really have anything that I want to talk about, or maybe not, but just in case that ever does come up, these are a few different areas that you can keep in the back of your mind to check in with the YPAs on. So one, their performance. What's going well? Talk about those starfish stories. So often we're looking at ourselves like trees, and we're only looking at the branches that aren't producing fruit or aren't producing flowers. And we're trying to think of how we can fertilize that tree so that it's going to create the outcome that we want to see, rather than focusing on the hundreds of other branches that are producing that flower and that fruit that we wish to see. So never be afraid to acknowledge what a YPA is doing well and encourage them to acknowledge their own successes for themselves, no matter how big or small that those successes might be. It's really important to talk about skill development. Maybe a YPA wants to learn more about motivational interviewing, or maybe they're having some challenges with documentation, whatever that may be. What is it that they need, and what is it that you can do as a supervisor to support them in developing those skills? Is there a conference that they can attend? Is there a training that they can attend? Is there something that you as a supervisor can do with them individually or with the group during supervision? Talk about also how it's going within the workplace. Do they feel like they are truly integrated within the organization? Do they feel like their voice matters? Are they having positive connections and relationships with other coworkers? And how can you support that if they might need it? Wellness. We always drive home the need for self-care, and it is really crucial. It's also a great way for you to promote how you are taking care of yourself in the workplace, both while you're at work and at home. Be that model for them, and also check in with them as to what they are doing to maintain their own wellness. And last but not least, their career development. YPAs are young, they are young professionals, and they have a long career ahead of them. However, it is also really important that we are focusing on how to develop them as the young professionals that they are and that they are destined to become. So maybe they want to go back to college. Does your organization offer tuition reimbursement? If they have their degree and they want to become certified in DBT or CBT, how can we do that? Whatever it may be, check in with them and ask what it is that they are hoping to get out of in their own leadership and career development. All right. It is super important that we have an authentic working alliance with the YPAs that we are supervising. So for one, we want to make sure that we're people. We're on that same level, even though there is that insinuated hierarchy. It is also important that we are coming to this genuine and trying to offer that authentic support. So the YPAs are comfortable coming to us and asking for support when they do need it. When we are confident in our relationship with YPAs, it increases the likelihood that they're going to want to talk to us, that they're going to be really open and be comfortable being vulnerable if they have taken a misstep. And they're also going to be much more comfortable asking for guidance on whatever it is that they might be hoping to get out of their career in the future. All right, some key elements to remember. We want to remain present with the YPAs. We all have a lot on our plates. We might be wanting to check through our emails. We might hear our phone buzzing, ringing throughout the time that we are in supervision with them. However, I highly encourage you to turn your phones off or put it on silent and really just focus in on that YPA. Try to really embody the fact that you are giving them your undivided attention. Practice that mutuality by sharing what it is or what it was like for you when you were starting out in the workplace. Maybe you are not a YPA, or maybe you didn't have YPA experience, but I'm sure regardless of who or where we are in our career, we have had some times when we were a little bit insecure. And it's okay to share those insecurities. And it's actually really encouraged because it shows that we're human. And it allows the YPA to say, okay, if my supervisor had this experience, it's okay that I'm having this experience too. We want to validate the experiences that YPAs are having. We want to validate their emotions. We want to validate their challenges. And then we also want to focus on a solution. So very similar to youth peer support services, we want to focus on that goal. What are we doing in every supervision to reach that goal that we are hoping to achieve? And we want to be accessible during the workday. So when I was starting out as a peer, my supervisor gave me a list of 3 other people when she wasn't present. And I can't tell you how supportive that was to me, just to know that if need be, I had somebody to reach out to. And that's really important that we are all doing this for our YPAs. Because one, yeah, we might have a scheduled date and time for supervision, but something might come up in their field work or when they're out in the community supporting youth that they need guidance on. And if they can't reach you, and if you're out, who else can they reach out to so that they don't feel like they're alone? That might ease some anxiety for them, and it can also really support them in developing strong connections with you and with other coworkers at your organization. Looking at the essential elements of supervision. So first and foremost, it's that bond, that authentic relationship that you have with the YPA. The next step, we want to look at the tasks. You know, how are we supporting the YPA to maintain their job duties that are listed in their job description? And then on top of everything, how are we supporting that YPA to reach their goals within their career? And how are we supporting them to grow as the young professional that they are? Some additional tips: we want to role model those self-care practices. We want to recognize those small successes, no matter how big or small that they might be. We want to remind YPAs that it is okay to have off days. There are days that we might come to work, and no matter who we are, how long we've been doing this, we might be tired, might be hungry, we might have some stuff going on in our personal lives, and we might not be operating at 100%. However, it's okay. And it is really crucial that we are encouraging YPAs to utilize their PTO, to utilize that paid time off and take days to take care of themselves when need be, to plan for vacations, and just to really take care of themselves both while they're at work and while they're at home. And last but not least, it's important for us to be open to feedback from YPAs. This is a brand new service. No matter if you were a YPA or not, the YPA that you are supervising might have some ideas on what can be done differently. It's okay to take that constructively and to listen to it with open ears and open mind. Maybe they're coming to you and they're saying, hey, so I'm not liking how the structure of our relationship is right now. Can we change this or change that? Try to take any sense of, personal attacks out of it and keep it focused on the work and encourage your YPA to do the same. But it's really important that we are open to receiving feedback and we're encouraging them to, quote, manage up. And finally, supervisor education that we have on the LMS with CTAC. First part is the YPA orientation training for supervisors, which is essentially the level 1 training that YPAs take when they are going through their level 1 training. And then we have the YPA hiring and support toolkit, which has a plethora of resources that offer you documents on hiring, retention, and just general support. Might have some documents for you to check in and keep a running list while you are offering that individualized support during supervision, etc. But I highly suggest that you check these out if you have not already. And at that point, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Jonathan Edwards.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Robbie, for the introduction, and thank you, Carrie Ann, for kicking us off, talking about your area of work, and just having the opportunity to work with you all recently has sort of renewed my energy and interest in supervision, or it's raised it to sort of a higher degree. So thank you so much for refreshing that interest. So I'm going to talk about 5 critical functions of supervision, but I'm going to also address some of what I call the guideposts gleaned from supervisory practice over the years prior to formally becoming a supervisor, during the time that I was formally supervising, and then that leading to a lot of conversations and consultancy afterwards. So I'm just going to start out by reviewing the guideposts that I've gleaned over the years, and there are 5. Individual survival to thriving partnership. And that really speaks to some of the collaborative presentations that I've done with my colleague, Gita Enders, who's the Director of Peer Services at New York City Health and Hospitals. And we've done a series of supervision as peers and then a subtitle. And the subtitle for several of our workshops have been supervision as collaboration, supervision as partnership, building out versus managing up. And so I've really condensed that into this topic of individual survival to thriving relationships. So it's moving away from the concern for, surviving as a supervisor to thriving in a partnership. I'm going to also talk a little bit about reflective practice and self-inventory. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 80-20 rule. Then 5 critical functions of supervision in practice, and then lastly, relationship before task. So here, hopefully I depicted this accurately, is that the top image shows, and I'll just use me, I'll make I statements. I'm drowning, I'm trying to do it all myself. I'm trying to be the big cheese. I'm trying to supervise people as opposed to fostering a supervisory process. And Carrie Ann and Robbie have spoken a lot about the partnership and setting it up as the meeting for the person and not for myself. And I think one of the things that I mentioned last week in our prep calls was that I went into supervision not deliberately being self-centered, but thinking it was all about how I was going to be assessed on my performance as a supervisor versus how much I was going to invest in the development of people I was supervising. And so I really needed to look at this as moving away from this concept of individual survival to a thriving partnership. And that involves communication, and not just how well I may want to sound or what I have to say, but my listening skills and my listening skills to people whom I'm supervising. I already mentioned the importance of collaboration. Having a title as supervisor does not mean that I have the best right answer. Oftentimes it means that I do not. And I think I've learned it's important to know what we don't know versus just as much as it's important to have a sense of what we do know. The mutuality is a really important concept, and it's one of the tenets of peer support. And so I think it appropriately belongs in the supervisory dyad. And of course, respect, it goes without saying, but we can never underestimate it. And so I include it here, as respect is not just saying that I respect you, but it's also demonstrating that through my actions and through my ability to listen and my admissions sometimes that I am wrong. And of course, the bottom image shows this harmonious rowing and working together. And, ideally we would be facing each other, but, nothing is perfect. We're rowing together, we're moving along, and we're working in concert for the good of the person who is presenting and accessing the services that we offer. The next thing I'm going to talk about is reflective practice and self-inventory. I like this one a whole lot. It reminds me that my work is never done, and there's a parallel process in supervision. Not only am I helping and coaching and supporting people and developing, but I'm also taking my own inventory. I'm assessing my own strengths, my developmental needs. Am I being impatient? Am I giving short shrift to people? Am I pretending to show up but really not? Am I really listening? You all mentioned turning off the device. I think that's really, really great guidance, because we would be quick to ask someone else to do that. And I think it's important that we give exactly, if not more, than what we're looking for. Examining implicit bias. And even as a Black gay male, it's really important for me to understand the implicit bias that I bring to the table. And I was just discussing a situation that happened a good decade ago about someone I was supervising who got into some trouble. And although on the surface I was trying to support the person while they were being investigated, I needed to further examine some of my belief systems about the person, and I needed to sort of pull the plug on my own tendency to be judgmental. And sometimes this comes years later, but at least we have the opportunity to regard people more strongly than we may have in the past. Understanding positionality, having the title, as I just said, does not mean that I am the expert. It means that I've been deputized with a role to guide people and to coach people. And there's an adage that says that, a good teacher wants the student to be better than they are. And once again, I've learned and I've grown to take great pride in helping people to develop to be the best that they can be, and even leave me in the dust. That's the role that I'm serving, is to help people to develop to their fullest potential. Dismantling stigmatizing beliefs, and that's not just in individual or group supervision, but it's also work across the organization. Dismantling stigmatizing beliefs doesn't mean that I'm running around and extinguishing everyone's false beliefs or disparaging comments, but it's about identifying the teachable moments and, sometimes using myself as an example without calling too much attention to myself. And that's pretty much a last resort that I would use. I think there have been times when I've been tempted to weaponize that in defense of peer supporters who may have been put down by other staff. And I realized that that's not the way to dismantle stigmatizing beliefs. If anything, I'm helping them to increase if I react as opposed to respond. So dismantling stigmatizing beliefs has to do with both micro level and macro level work in identifying and working with people to rethink how they think and to rethink how they regard individuals and to rethink how we equate one's past experiences with their current capabilities. And last but not least is a wellness self-check. And I always contend that this is really important for all staff. And I think the litmus test is if I can't say something to all staff, then perhaps I am setting a double standard. And wellness self-check, I really put this here more for myself than anyone else, because I once had a supervisor who said, you know, I need to make sure that I put the oxygen mask on myself first. So in as much as I need to be present for the people I supervise, I also need to make sure that I'm taking care of myself. And that comes with really good boundary setting. I believe Carrie Ann or Robbie said, you know, regularly scheduled versus regularly occurring. There's a great distinction there, and things come up and sometimes we do have to move things, but make sure that we're always being accountable and make sure that we're always giving the proper time to a person that they deserve. Third, I'm going to talk about the 80-20 rule. This is one of my favorites, and I first learned this in business training as the Pareto principle. I think it has to do with populations in a certain part of Italy where 20% of the population possessed 80% of the wealth, and you know the rest of that equation. And so I've seen this applied to many different paradigms. I call it the time management quandary, and I hope that I depicted this accurately, that on the left side, and we see the imbalance of 20% of my time being spent on 80% of the tasks, but conversely, on the right-hand side, 80% of my time is spent on 20% of my tasks. Now, I didn't want to pathologize the administrative function of supervision by saying the administrative tasks take up so much time, because they're really important and they're grounding. But I used to complain that, oh my God, I have to do these performance evaluations and I have to take supervision notes and I have to do all this work, and it's keeping me from doing the coaching that I really want to do with people. And someone needed to remind me that, you know, we don't love all parts of our job. And so there has to be a way to work around and to manage this 80-20 imbalance. And sometimes that involves getting to work an hour early, you know, answering emails at a certain time of the day, setting aside time and protecting time to take care of the administrative tasks as best as possible, and freeing oneself up for being on call, which I think a good supervisor ideally would be on call. I've seen very few people in my very long career of working at least openly demonstrate this ability to kind of walk freely. Usually that person who walks freely, people might say, oh, they don't have enough work or they're slacking off, but sometimes it's because they really got their stuff together, right? And I'm still working on that, you know, trying to get those administrative tasks done, and not necessarily on the weekend. You know, manageability is not working 7 days and saying I got all my work done. And then there's delegation versus micromanagement. And that requires a great deal of trust. Another one of my favorite management theories is by McGregor, and it's theory Y, and it's the assumption that the people I'm working with are competent, are going to do their best, and that they regard work as much as they regard play, and that might be Maslow. But it's very difficult, because I have called myself delegating and then, you know, not even peeking over the fence, but, you know, maybe delegating, but then I don't stop talking about how it should be done. And so that's a very, that's a skill that really needs to be, you know, honed. Establishing priorities. I don't think I have to explain that. Walk with me, please, is just something that I've learned from people who may allow themselves to get bogged down by people showing up at the office, phone calls. Now that we're in a virtual age, I say phone calls, but they always say, like, sometimes you have to, you know, keep moving and say to the person, I hear you. And I'm not talking about the supervisee, because you should be doing that in privacy, but just your colleagues, you know, who want to stop you or, you know, talk to you and you're trying to stay on schedule. And sometimes you have to say, oh, you know, do you mind walking with me? Or can I walk you here and I'll fill you in on this? So it's really about being innovative with time management, and then protecting time equals protecting self. And I think that equates back to the wellness self-check that I talked about earlier. But I absolutely love this principle because sometimes in order to seek balance, we have to understand imbalance. And, I could never see this too much. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the genesis of this 5-function model of supervision. I don't know how I'm doing for time. And I think if I try to look in the chat and see, I may mess up the screen. So I'm just going to go on faith and hurry up and finish.
You're okay, Justin.
I'm okay?
Yes.
Great. So just to give a little background here, and I'm actually going to read something, affirmed and encouraged by my supervisor in 2009 to take stock of the myriad functions and tasks embedded in my role as a director and supervisor of nearly 30 peer support specialists, I began to think more critically about how the workplace roles and my own personal lived experience both inform and potentially limit my judgment when conducting supervision. 2 key things came to mind. And the first one is that I needed to flesh out the layers and tasks of supervision in an organized matrix. And 2, I needed to be deeply reflective about fairness and accountability when engaging supervisees in responding to their workplace concerns, including personal situations or circumstances that would inevitably impact how they show up in their job. Since my major concern was that I would be too stringent or too lenient when responding to supervisees, I initially conceptualized this multifunction supervision model as an accountability tool to help guide me through the maze of workplace situations that come up in supervision. This was a vital process since I embodied both a lived experience perspective and academic credentials, which oftentimes in our community is seen as a curse. And in fact, I identified as a peer supporter, even though I had a management position. I was a licensed master social worker at the time, and I was applying to a doctoral program, which by the grace of God, I finished 8 years later. I was also a researcher, a coach, a change agent, and often a person struggling with my own recovery process. And so this model, in sum, helped me to identify the myriad roles of supervisor. And I thought it was really sexy when my supervisor said, consider yourself wearing many hats. And I said, oh, I can, launch onto that. Examining the structure of supervision, not just what I'm saying to people, but what I'm doing and how those tasks are delineated. Also to embed accountability for myself, organize tasks chronologically across 5 functions, but also anticipate that they may not always happen sequentially, and to be flexible, and to promote advocacy, which once again goes outside of that closed space and into the organization, so that I am constantly helping to move the needle and not just depending on the peer support worker to change the culture. I'm not going to take time to go through this, but this is the 5 critical functions of supervision in practice. Basically, it's the administrative support of educate, advocate, and evaluate functions, with 3 examples of what each one means. This is available in the slides, and I will just say that I always contend that supervision begins long before the person is sitting on one side of the desk. It really begins when we're trying to identify people who will bring the right fit to the job. It has to do with onboarding a person, helping to orient a person to the policies and procedures, and it goes through evaluation, which is a lot more than just putting together an annual performance evaluation. It really is an ongoing developmental process. So we also use this in many of our presentations, and Rita and myself and Dr. Joanne Forbes and Dr. Amy Spagnolo and Gita Enders are actually doing a lot of work on model testing this to really determine what competencies best approximate supervisory practice. Lastly, someone I learned about when I was an IO psych major years ago is Mary Parker Follett. And I just want to say very briefly as I wrap up that she was a social worker. She is seen as one of the founders of management theories. And she had certain principles of coordination, and even though you speak largely to management, I thought that they transfer well over to supervision and just workplace relationships. And some of those principles of coordination have to do with direct contact, early stages, reciprocal relationship, and continuous process. And there's also 3 management principles: integration, power with as opposed to power over. And I think I've heard Rita speak about that before, and also group power. So just very quickly, the integration has to do with workers at all levels needing to work together in accord toward that ultimate business goal. The power with, rather than establishing a strict hierarchy of delegating power to certain individuals over others, Follett believed that leaders should practice coactive power. And lastly, group power. Follett made the case that leaders should value group power over personal power, and her theory suggests that true leaders create power for the group rather than keeping it for themselves. I go back to, and I'll wrap up by saying that as supervisor, I would only hope that I learn from the supervisee. And it's very much a reciprocal bidirectional learning process. Thank you so much. And I did not say that this pertained mostly to adults. I really appreciate that we've heard about youth peer support. And this model has really been conceptualized around supervision of adults, but we're looking at ways to apply this and adapt it to the needs of other factions of the peer support workforce. Now I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Dr. Joanne Forbes, who's going to talk a little bit about her research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And I want to thank Robbie and Carrie for what they said earlier. I think what you'll find as I talk about my research, that there's wisdom that's already out there. And those of us who sometimes travel in academic circles really are there for the purpose of validating what everyone has already discovered in real life and real practice. So as Jonathan mentioned, I will be talking about peer support primarily for adults, but it's very clear that it pertains to other communities as well. The research that I did really was in response to the 2007 suggestion by CMS that supervisors of peer support specialists be mental health professionals or mental health qualified people as decided by each state. And what I saw unfold across the country is that most states interpreted that guidance as meaning that a licensed professional was the person who was going to supervise a peer support specialist. I've been working in peer support since the 1980s, when at that time we were talking about psychiatric survivors, the ex-patient movement. We were talking about mutual self-help, and peer support was really happening in those arenas where those who were struggling in their recovery and struggling to find a life for themselves really depended on each other, because the answers weren't particularly available in the mental health system at that time. So when the guidance came out and I saw that suggestion, I was really rocked back on my heels, and it really encouraged me to go back to school, get my doctorate, and do this research. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today is some of the findings, and I think you will recognize that you've heard it already today. It was specifically directed towards non-peer supervisors because that was the norm that CMS was suggesting. And I wanted to understand that. So my research involved talking to peer support specialists across the country to discover what was going on, what was that like. And it's important to remind ourselves that lived experience is not the same as academic credentials. And many of us cross over, and that's fine. But there was an assumption in that guidance that someone who had never worked as a peer support specialist had the understanding and knowledge to supervise somebody who had. I'm sure if the roles were reversed, if someone in CMS said peer support specialists should be supervising the social workers, the psychiatric nurses, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the mental health counselors, there would have been a different reaction. But that's not what they said. They said the other way around. And so, as we all know, lived experience and those interventions that we bring to the table differ in very important, credible ways from professional, academically inspired interventions, because they often involve the relationships, personal self-disclosure. Oh my goodness. Back, in the 80s, personal self-disclosure was such a rule breaker. I cannot begin to tell you. But lived experience also talks about empowerment and role modeling hope and recovery, which back then and even in a lot of places today is not understood within the academic, professionally licensed scope. So as I went about my research, I'm going to share with you today the major findings. I will say out loud what my colleagues who've presented it with me before know already. The findings were so rich and so remarkable to talk to people that I could really spend the rest of the day talking about it, but I will be circumspect and just try to keep within my time frame. Not surprising, the number one finding across the country unanimously was that peer support specialists wanted and still want to be supervised by a more experienced peer. Makes sense, right? If you're doing a job, you want to learn from someone who's already done that job, that knows the ropes, who knows how to anticipate the issues. And that was not always possible when you were being supervised by someone who'd never done that job. So not a surprising finding. I'm glad it got out there in terms of research, because we really need to make sure that's happening more and more across our community. The other 4 areas that were important, as I said, you've heard about, really had to do with supervisors' attitude, the issue of role integration, trauma-informed supervision, and building supports. Now, although the research was focused on non-peer supervisors, it really is applicable to peer supervisors as well. So I want to talk to you about how you can use this information in supervision. And if you're wondering why I would put a picture of a ballet here, it's because of what you've already heard. Supervision is a dance. It's mutual, it's a relationship, it's a give and take. And certainly successful supervision is based on really positive relationship abilities, the ability to listen, to be present. And many of my presenters here with me talked about that earlier. It's really important that relationship, mutual relationship, is established. So what about the supervisor's attitude? Now, some folks who hear this feel defensive, like, there's nothing wrong with my attitude. Well, probably not. But for peer support specialists who often are creating a new role and coming to a team that's not had it before, and they're very much pioneering, often are excruciatingly sensitive to the supervisor's attitude. And what my research discovered is that how the supervisor approached the task really made all the difference. Folks generally were positive about their supervisor. And as long as the supervisor had these qualities and demonstrated respect, positive, non-judgmental regard, and supported autonomous functioning, it went very well. It was the supervisors who, I believe, probably from their own anxiety, who micromanaged. They were not received as well because the peer realized that the supervisor had never done the job, didn't really know what they were talking about, and frequently were interpreting circumstances and issues through the perspective of a clinical lens. So many of the supervisors who said to the peer, listen, I don't know what you do. I've never done it, but I believe you know. And I respect that. I've got your back. I'm here for you. You do what you do best, and we'll figure it out together. That's kind of the epitome of what I mean by the supervisor's attitude. It's that open, positive, non-judgmental regard and the ability to manage anxiety and let someone do their job, even though you're not really familiar with it. You will learn in mutual discussion with the peer support worker what it is. The other thing that folks cannot forget is that role integration, bringing peer support into organizations, which obviously PeerTac is all about, it's still unfolding. And so role integration is not complete. It's not like a peer support specialist is hired into this totally welcoming, clear environment. So supervisors take a very important lead in helping to establish the role clarity and what I call role potency. The supervisor is the one, if you're a non-peer, who establishes with your colleagues that this job is important. It's going to make a difference in how we view what we do on the academic side and how people find their way into recovery. That is the job of the supervisor, which if you're a supervisor as a social worker, psychologist, a nurse, that's a new role that you've had to do before, but keep it in mind as you go forward. One of the ways that many peer support specialists had help with this, they were invited to give presentations and talk about themselves and what they do and how they see the world. And that helped with role clarity. The potency part for the supervisor is being open to the peer saying, this is not my job. I'm not the medication police. I don't drive the van. Although if I have a chance to talk to people about my recovery and role model hope, maybe I can drive the van and do that too, but really have to pay attention to role potency and make sure that drift is not happening or co-optation. This has been talked about many times by my colleagues here today. Trauma-informed supervision, of course, is helpful in whatever position you're in. It often is interpreted as just focusing on that self-care, and it's very important, absolutely important. But what my research revealed is there are other layers that a supervisor needs to pay attention to. And one that was interesting and surprising is that compassion fatigue, that burnout that you hear about, which is very well known in the helping professions, that happens quicker and with more intensity for peer support specialists. And the other thing that is now getting talked about more and more is moral injury. Now, moral injury used to belong to the military, right? Soldiers who were in conflict situations and ended up having to do things that was so against who they were and their beliefs that this term moral injury came about to really talk to that soldiers were witnessing and carrying out acts that absolutely cut through their value system and was untenable. We're hearing more and more about moral injury in healthcare after COVID, because healthcare workers were asked to triage, to make decisions that under any other circumstances they would not have been asked to make. But it's coming up in peer support, because peer support specialist workers are frequently faced with situations which are in direct conflict to their values, to who they are, to what they want to see happen. I mean, the most glaring examples are coercive treatments and behaviors. If you're working on crisis teams, frequently interacting with community outreach, the police and first responders in situations that are frightening, but also things unravel very quickly. Those are the arenas where we're seeing moral injury, and a lot more, I'm sure, as well. One of the things to keep in mind about compassion fatigue, moral injury, is that what was helpful was the opportunity to talk about it right after it happened. And I'm so pleased that my colleagues here talked about supervision being scheduled and the difference between scheduled and held. Because as we know, supervision is one of those things that is esteemed, but not paid for. You can't bill for supervision in most arenas, and often doesn't happen because of the other pressures that are occurring on the job. But as I think Ravi had said, as a supervisor, make sure your supervisee has a way to contact you, no matter what, so that if one of these arenas come up where they're just holding on by their fingernails and they've witnessed something egregious to them, they can get hold of you and you can have an opportunity to debrief with them and get them through it. The last finding is that supervisors really need to pay attention to building those supports. And there are two ways that we talk about it. One is creating that facilitative environment, the welcoming environment, the empowering environment, the one that helps with role clarity. And that is a very active, proactive position for the supervisor to take, to recognize that maybe members of the team are still out of touch with their own stigmatizing behaviors or language, or maybe they're out of touch with the behaviors that are perceived as microaggressions. The supervisor needs to be the one to see it, or if they don't see it, be open to hearing it from their peer support specialists. You know, the language in that team meeting really was hurtful, or however it comes up. It's the supervisor's role to be able to hear it and also to figure out how to work with the colleagues to promote that welcoming, facilitative, empowering environment. Because stigma is alive and well. You know, we've been talking about stigma for a very long time. And I think there have been some changes in a positive direction, but we still have a long way to go. So just because your organization has hired a peer support worker, that doesn't give you a pass on being really attentive to those stigmatizing problems in the workplace. And the last thing to really think about is creating those opportunities for networking. Again, my colleagues talked about, you know, the regional meetings and the conferences, making sure peer support workers get to those places, but also have opportunities to network inside the organization. If you have more than one peer support worker, you have several, make sure they come in contact with each other, have lunch together, same office together, however you do it as a supervisor, it's really important. And also to identify those virtual learning communities, those other places where peers and peer supporters congregate so that they have an opportunity to network and to get support outside the organization. That's kind of the really quick and dirty version of the research. As I said, I could talk about it a long time, but I don't want to take up more time. I want to hand it over to my colleague, Rita Cronice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And I want to thank all of our presenters today. Just a quick summary. Best practices for supervising youth peer advocates, that was Robbie Lettieri. Best practices for supervising family peer advocates, that was Carrie Ann Rollier. Jonathan talked about way more than the 5 critical functions of supervision. He actually talked about guideposts that he had learned along the way, which were just amazing. And thanks for that expanded presentation, Dr. Edwards. And what peer support workers tell us about experiences in supervision and what non-peer supervisors need to know. And thank you very much for that, Dr. Forbes. Next week, I wanted to mention that we will be having, as part of our consultation session, and I'll mention a little more about that, but we're doing a sneak preview of a brand new online tool that's been under development for supervisors to do a self-reflection on what they know about peer support values. So we'll do a quick demonstration of that before we go into the rest of the consultation session. I just wanted to let you know that that's coming up. You can submit any last minute questions through the chat. Anything that you submit now, we will bring to the consultation session next time, unless we have a little bit of time at the end of today's session. Again, next week, we will be having at the same time, same bat channel on April 20th, the consultation session, and we'll be bringing back our presenters for today and a few other consultants that we that have expertise in supervision. So we hope we'll see you back then. This recording should be available by Friday or soon after, and that will be up on our PeerTech, www.peertech.org website. For those of you that are looking for continuing education, if you are an adult certified peer specialist, then there is a continuing education course that's available on the Academy. We won't see the actual course up there, but you can go in and take the test because you've seen the whole webinar. You can take the quiz for that. When you take the quiz and complete the course evaluation, you can get a certificate immediately, or you can wait until we actually create the course, which will be a month or 2 down the road. And for the youth peer advocates and family peer advocates, just save the email that you received from this event and submit it with your renewal application to obtain continuing education credits. With each of our webinars, we have resources for more information. We have a frequently asked questions document that we'll be updating as more questions and answers come in through these webinars. Each one of our webinars has its own resource that gives you the bios of each of the presenters and the contact information for them, as well as resources they've shared. And there's also access to the OMH guidance in the Part 599 clinic. There's OMH guidance that's a really good guidance document. And I also want to just put a little plug in for a book that Dr. Edwards, Dr. Forbes, Gita Enders, and we edited for the National Association of Peer Supporters as all of the proceeds from the book go to the National Association. It's called What It Takes, Wisdom from Peer Support Specialists and Supervisors. And we had about 40 people that contributed to the book. They were all people that had presented at the national conference over the years, and they summarized what they had presented on, and that's what's in the book. So it's really very much real work, real practice from real world practitioners. And you can get that on Amazon.com. And if you look at the resource file, when you get that from this webinar, you'll be able to access it there. If you are an organizational leader in one of the motor clinics, we'd like you to take the organizational survey. That is also on the resource file, and you can also put it in the chat. And again, if you have any questions, please submit them through the chat. Here's our contact information. The website is www.peertech.org. You can reach us by email, You can join our listserv and you can see our frequently asked questions. And I wanted to take just a moment to, and here's the contact information for our presenter. So all of this will be in the slides when you get the presentation. And I just wanted, before we end, to invite Matthew McDonald, who is my counterpart through the Academy of Peer Services on PeerTech, and Joanne Forbes, to just mention a little bit about a special project they've been doing for supervision. Matthew?
Sure. Thank you so much, Rita. So I came on board the Academy of Peer Services back in June of last year for the purpose of developing 5 specialization tracks for New York Certified Peer Specialists. This is on the adult side. I worked closely with Dr. Forbes on that project for many months. One of those specialization tracks is in supervision of peer supporters. And some of the topics included, well, let me back up just a moment and say that we are working on releasing that training in another capacity to people other than certified peer specialists, and sort of disseminating it widely, because we all feel as a team here, especially Rita, Joanne, and myself, that a lot of what's contained in that training is applicable to both peers who are supervising peers, as well as clinicians or people who do not identify as having lived experience to be supervising peers. Joanne, would you like to say anything more about some of the contents of the training?
Sure, Matthew, I'll be happy to jump in. There are 5 modules of about 2 hours in length, give or take, depending on your speed reading abilities. But it covers everything from what is supervision, because there's confusion about that. Although with Dr. Edwards' work now, it's getting clarified about what belongs in supervision and what doesn't. But the modules range from what is supervision to the myths and the realities of supervision and working with folks with lived experience. There's also some effort to talk about you as a non-peer supervisor and what you need to be aware of and think about. It's really a comprehensive course. We certainly enjoyed working with the subject matter experts who put it together. And as Matthew mentioned, the goal is hopefully in the fall to have it up on the APS website for anyone who wants to partake, to have an opportunity to go through that course. Matthew, I'll hand it back to you.
Oh, thanks so much, Joanne. I think you've covered it. I'll pass it back to Rita. A bit of a volley here.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I'm glad you had a chance to mention that, because I think it's going to be a valuable course for people to take. And I also want to continue to put the plug in for the toolkits that the youth peer advocates and the family peer advocates have, because they have supervision information in those toolkits as well, which are really a valuable resource. So there's a lot of resources that are available on supervision. And I just really wanted to thank my partners at McSilver with PeerTech. You know, we've come together, and I think we're doing a pretty great job of starting to really reach out and allow people to see what is possible for peer support services as they're included into these clinical settings. I especially want to thank Carrie Ann Rollier. I want to thank Robbie Lettieri. I want to thank Dr. Jonathan Edwards, and I want to thank Dr. Joanne Forbes for your presentation today. I want to thank the Office of Mental Health for sponsoring this whole project. And I want to thank all of you who came today. Thank you very much for being here. Have a great day.